You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast, where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I am answering a listener question. Cheryl wrote in and was curious about working with a child diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. And specifically, how does ODD heal or resolve through the child-centered model? So Cheryl, thank you so much for the question. I think this is really helpful. We see symptoms of all kinds of diagnoses all the time, and often children come in and parents inform us that they've already been diagnosed with things, or they're at least considering specific diagnoses because of the behavior. So we will end up working with kids who have been diagnosed or they're considering an ODD diagnosis. And I think it's helpful to understand what that might look like and how the child-centered play therapy process actually helps to address that type of diagnosis. So let me read you her question, and then we'll kind of dive into some thoughts. So her question is, how does a child with oppositional defiant disorder heal through child-centered play therapy? I have one child I'm seeing that seems to have these symptoms, and I recently started CCPT with him. It seems he is expressing more anger in his play each time, and then she clarified it's battles with ninja guys. And then she said, very tentative at first, and now he can use the word dead. Okay, so I'm going to dive into some thoughts. I think I can unpack this pretty succinctly. But before I go in that direction, let me just make my opinion very clear. And I'm letting you know it is an opinion. And I know there are going to be others that have a difference of opinion, and that's okay. I'm very happy to agree to disagree. But here's what I think I need to tell you, even if you don't necessarily agree with me. I am really quite bothered and frustrated and annoyed by the diagnoses that children are being given. And if you've listened to this podcast for long enough, you know I am anti-medication, I'm anti-diagnoses, and we don't bill insurance, so we don't diagnose, and there's a whole rationale behind that. So if you want to go back and listen to my thoughts on all of those scenarios and components of our work, those are in earlier episodes. But here's why I'm so frustrated and annoyed. Because it is very easy to look at diagnostic criteria and check boxes and say, yes, the child meets criteria for ODD, or yes, the child meets criteria for ADHD, or yes, the child meets criteria for fill in the blank. And my issue with this is usually the diagnosing professional is a pediatrician that sees them one time a year and gets a parent complaining in their ear. My kid never listens. He tells me no all the time. He's so defiant. He just does not respect authority at all. Oh, that sounds like ODD. Here's the diagnosis. Here's the medication. And while there are 100% kids that have chemical imbalances and physiological and biological and developmental stuff that warrants a diagnosis, I'm not anti-diagnosis as a standard rule, but I very much have an issue with the fact that we have a lot of people that are just so quick to diagnose, and I don't necessarily believe that that is appropriate. So I'm telling you all that to say, Cheryl and anyone else that is told this child has this diagnosis, I would encourage you to take that with a grain of sand or a grain of salt, whatever, a really small morsel. And I would like you to consider the possibility that you can explain the behaviors and you can help someone understand why the child is behaving that way. And it really has nothing to do with the diagnosis. So for example, I have parents that come in and say, oh, my kid has ADHD. And they give me all the behaviors and all the scenarios why they, can support this ADHD diagnosis. And I'm constantly psychoeducating families and saying, I'm wondering if you're aware that all of the symptoms that you described can be caused by emotional upheaval and dysregulation and social incapacity and psychological stress. And, I'm wondering if you've considered that there are other possibilities. And yes, the behaviors map, right? I'm not saying that if we look at a checklist, we can't say, yes, this kid has 11 of 13, right? But what I'm saying is there are other explanations other than the child is hyperactive. There are other explanations other than the child is oppositionally defiant. So please just keep it in the back of your mind. You don't always have to agree with me, and that's okay. I'm very happy to just coexist, even if I can't see eye to eye on things. But please at least consider the fact that just because a child has been given a diagnosis, it doesn't necessarily always seem warranted. And what I encourage parents when they tell me the diagnoses that their children have been given, I say, okay, thanks so much for telling me. Let's complete an entire treatment plan of the child-centered play therapy approach, and we'll see if we'd like to circle back and revisit that, and if diagnostic criteria is still met, and if you feel that a diagnosis is still warranted. And I can tell you, in almost 20 years of doing this, I've only had one family. In the thousands that I've worked with, I've had one family still pursue a diagnosis and medication after play therapy. Why? Because play therapy is a holistic approach that helps the child heal, and the symptoms are just the way the child is showing you how they're hurting. So if we recognize behaviors and actions and symptoms are because the child is hurting, let's address the hurt, and then we'll reevaluate, right? And if the child still meets diagnostic criteria, absolutely, let's move forward with figuring out what's going on. So that was my soapbox rant. Sorry, thanks for staying with me. I have a fundamental problem with thinking that every child needs to be diagnosed. So don't let that get in the way of using the child-centered model and knowing that the child's going to heal through play therapy. And then, you can assess at that point. So all that to say, let's talk through specifically to answer your question, Cheryl, how does a child with ODD heal through CCPT was your question. So I think first and foremost, I want to tackle the three major outcomes that I think are going to be the most significant in a child who presents with ODD tendencies. And that is, first and foremost, self-control and self-regulation. So as a child goes through the child-centered process, they are learning how to self-control. They are learning how to self-regulate. They are learning that it is not just about the here and now in this moment. And if you look at diagnostic criteria for ODD, it is almost always that they are defiant and they are disobedient and they buck authority and they don't want anything to do with those types of scenarios. And that's understandable because you have a child who really cannot control themselves whatsoever. And so what happens? All the adults in their life try to control their behavior for them, which makes them resentful and angry and retaliatory and all these other things. So we can understand why you would have a child that seems that way, but if they were to develop self-control and self-regulation, it would immediately address so many of those issues. Secondly, there is a huge power shift that takes place in the child-centered approach. And what I mean by that is a child comes into the playroom and they either are constantly grasping at power, so they're extremely power hungry and they're always willing to power struggle and they're always going to fight for any measure of control that they can get. Or on the other side of the pendulum, we talk about a pendulum swing, right? On the other side of the pendulum, you have kids that feel completely powerless and they feel that they have absolutely no control. So you have kids who feel that they have had no power and control, or you have kids that are constantly seeking power and control and they will swing to the other side, realize that neither of those are healthy, and then they find the center and therefore the balance, which is I have power sometimes and I don't always have to have it. I have control at some point, but I'm not always trying to fight for control. So the power shift is huge because the playroom, there's full autonomy, full freedom, full ability to do whatever you need to do, and you get to be in charge. So for a child who doesn't like being told what to do, doesn't like authority, doesn't like rules, doesn't like having to be obedient, all of a sudden that reduces the frustration because you no longer have a child that is being forced into doing things. They just get to be in charge. So the power shift is huge because they find balance. And then third, they develop an internal locus of control. When you have an extremely defiant child, an extremely oppositional child, That essentially is another way to describe a child that is constantly being told how they should act, and therefore they wait for someone else to regulate for them. So of course, in that scenario then, I'm going to get as out of control as I want to get, go as far as I want to go, lose all sense of propriety and obedience and understanding limits and rules and boundaries. But someone will step in and fix it, regulate, control me, do whatever they need to do to make things better. Therefore, they have an external locus of control. Everything is from without rather than within. But the child-centered process encourages an internal motivation, an internal locus of control. So therefore, the child starts to want to develop these skills because they know they have the capacity to do so. And look, let's go all the way back to the beginning. And if you're new to the podcast, hi, so glad you're here. Welcome to the Play Therapy podcast family. If you did not start at episode 1 and you have not gone in chronological order, please go back and do that. For those of you that have been with me forever, remember when we talked about when you have children in the play therapy process, the child-centered model is directly from Rogers. So if you think about Rogers' concepts and Rogerian principles, it's your core conditions and self-actualization. So let's map that to the child-centered play therapy approach. You have a child that is wired and destined to self-actualize. No kid wants to stay stuck. No kid wants to be set in dysfunction. No kid wants to feel like they can't regulate and control and figure out their problems. So if we believe in this model, even back to Rogers, and we understand that the child will always be working toward more self-enhancing behaviors, they just don't always have the time, the tools, or the opportunity to get there, then therefore, we have to trust that this model allows them to become the person they've always wanted to be. It's really easy to brand or label an ODD child, and I don't even want to say ODD child because I hate that. A child that has been diagnosed with ODD, it's really easy to brand and label them as manipulative and deceitful and hateful and spiteful and anti-authority and all these things. We can throw all these labels out all day long, which really, as a related aside, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people start to treat you in that way, you become that way, whether you want to or not. So why does the child-centered model work? Because we have unconditional love. We have unconditional acceptance, even at your worst, even when you are spiteful, even when you are hateful, even when you buck authority, even when you want nothing to do with the rules and the limits that are in this playroom, even when you are as difficult as you can possibly be. I accept you in this moment for who you are, unconditional love and regard. Be with attitudes at all times. I'm here, I hear you, I understand, I care, and I delight in you. And the reality is that opens up the door for the child to say, gosh, I really don't want to stay stuck here. Let's figure out how to get out of this mess. Because no one wants to stay stuck in their dysfunction. No one, especially not kids. Kids are wired to be happy and play and, just be an innocent, naive little bundle of joy. If they're not, there's a reason. So if you have ODD tendencies and ODD behaviors, that is just the cue that the child is giving you as to their hurt and their pain and what they're trying to heal and recover from. So those are the three overarching things that I think, to answer your question, Cheryl, how does a child with ODD heal through the process? I think those are the three pretty consistent ways that they heal. But let me throw this out as well. So again, in an earlier episode, we talked about the 4 universal outcomes of play therapy. So let's look at that really quickly because those are child-specific issues, right? But then what about the universal outcomes of play therapy? Would it be helpful for a child with oppositionally defiant tendencies to have an increased worldview? That what I choose to do in this moment impacts other people, it impacts my future, it impacts the situation, it impacts the circumstance? Yes, of course, hugely healing. What about an increase in self-esteem? What do you think is at the root of almost all dysfunctional behavior? Low self-esteem, low self-concept, no sense of identity, no self-worth. So if a child builds self-esteem, does that not make them behave in more self-enhancing ways? Of course. Does it get rid of some of those oppositionally defiant behaviors? Of course. What about increased regulation? When across all spectra, you just control yourself more efficiently and more effectively, does that take away some of those ODD tendencies? Of course. What about emotional vocabulary and IQ? When you understand your feelings, you can accurately identify them, and then you can effectively communicate them to the people around you. What do you think kids that are oppositionally defiant are dealing with? Huge emotions. And the only way they know to demonstrate those is to be difficult. But if they were able to say, I don't like it when you do this because it hurts my feelings and I get really mad at you, that's a game changer for a child that's been diagnosed with ODD, because your needs are only met when you communicate them effectively. So they need an emotional IQ and an emotional vocabulary. Those are the 4 universal outcomes of the child-centered model. Child-specific issues aside, if a child diagnosed with ODD achieved those 4 outcomes, it would be a monumental change for the child, not only in the moment, but forever. So Cheryl, thank you so much for sending that. I hope that this helps all of us, because I think it's so important to recognize that, first of all, the diagnosis does not really influence anything that we do in the playroom. It should never be anything that we consider when we're working with a child. And the goal is always that the child self-actualizes. And at that point, it really doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. It really doesn't matter what the child has been branded or labeled as, or, oh, this is the bad kid that always gets in trouble. Well, it's really easy for a kid that's told you're the bad kid that gets in trouble to be the bad kid that gets in trouble. But when you walk into a child-centered playroom with a child-centered play therapist, and they don't say, but they communicate, I'm here, I hear you, I understand, I care, I delight in you. And you get to be in charge, and I trust you. And I know that you're capable of doing the work that you need to do. And I will unconditionally love and accept you no matter what happens in here. And there is nothing you can do to break the relationship that we're going to build. That is a monumental change from any other relationship that child has ever had, any other environment that child has ever had. And that's powerful. So hope that's helpful. Cheryl, thank you for your question. If you would like to reach out to me, either just to say hello, to let me know how the podcast has influenced your work, your practice, your understanding of the model, anything you want to share with me, even if it's a question to cover on an episode, I would love to hear from you. Brenna at thekidcounselor.com. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you that you continue to reach out and let me know that you're out there listening all over the world. That's so special to me. I look forward to talking with you again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.